Okay, now the other side of the coin is if we do have full information, we can do what's called a bottom-up forecast. So if I'm inside the firm or if I'm a consultant working for the firm, I'm going to have way more information. I'm going to have the information that the firm knows about its own customers. And so I can project demand by looking at my actual historical numbers. You can imagine that Ford has a very good idea of what the total market of the world is and all the different cars they sell and what their share of all those different sectors is going to be. And we're going to know information about our existing customers and how often they repurchase cars and how often they buy new cars and whether they stay with Ford and whether they're happy with it. And so we're going to have a lot more information that lets us project demand. And if we're going to institute pricing changes or we think pricing changes are warranted based on the existing market, we can estimate new demand. In other words, new customers that come to us and turnover from our old customers, whether we're going to lose customers if prices change, things like that. So it's actually a much easier process if you have full information, which I guess is hopefully, that goes without saying. The more information you have, the easier this kind of decision making and forecasting is going to be. So then we have short-term revenue forecasts, we extend those to long-term revenue forecasts, and we incorporate any changes that the firm is expected to make. Are we releasing new cars or things like that? Top-down or bottom-up, this is the most important part of the process. And we got to make sure that we do everything in our power to get these numbers right, because a lot of the remaining forecasts are going to be dependent on the forecast for revenue. So next we forecast the income statement and then the balance sheet. So that's the next two steps. Again, here it might be better to just go straight to the example problem. We use the exact same numbers, the income statement balance sheet that's presented here in the slides. I walk through it one by one, giving explanations of how we come up with the forecast ratios and how we use them. But so here I'm just going to give an overview, and you can see that these numbers track up and match together when you go over to the example, right? But here's the main steps for doing the forecast mechanically. We do it in three parts. The first part is, and most importantly, we need to really think about for each line item on the income statement, we need to decide what economically drives that line item. In other words, we thought deeply about revenue, and we know that what drives revenue is your market share and the market demand. But then we think about cost, and I say, okay, if I'm going to predict costs for the following year, what is the best driver of cost of goods sold? Well, hopefully, it's you recognize that the best driver of cost of goods sold is going to be revenue, because the more I sell, the higher my revenue, the higher my cost of goods sold. These are the variable costs associated with producing product. So the more product I produce and sell, the more costs I'm going to have that are associated with doing that. So I'm going to decide what economically drives the line item, and this can be sometimes tricky and sometimes obvious, right? So if we walk down the top of the income statement here with selling and general expenses, well, again, that's directly tied to how much product I sell. And the bigger I am, the more SG&A I'm going to have. And so it's going to, again, be a function of revenue. But then when we look at depreciation, well, here we recognize, once we think about it, that depreciation isn't a function of revenue. Well, sort of indirectly, I guess it is. But directly, it's a function of fixed assets. Those are what we're depreciating. So our depreciation expense is calculated directly from our existing fixed assets at the beginning of the year. So our depreciation expense is going to be a function of last year's net PP&E. Right? So that's what we need to do. We need to walk through each item on the income statement, whatever it might be for that firm, and think about what drives this line item. Then we can estimate the forecast ratio. Right? And the ratio is going to be really simple. Because cost of goods sold is a function of revenue, we are just going to say that the best prediction is that this function stays the same, and the function is just a ratio here. So here in this example, we'll say cost of goods sold was 37.5% of 2014's revenue. That's a good prediction for 2015. We'll say that based on our prediction about actual revenue in 2015, we think cost of goods sold should remain 37.5% of revenue. So that's step 3. To calculate the cash amounts in the forecasted income statement, multiply the forecast ratio by an estimate of its driver. Here, multiply 37.5% by the estimated revenue in 2015. And again, you can see all of this actually working in practice in the Excel example. Right. And so you can see here how I convert the forecast ratio for cost of goods sold in 2014. Cost of goods sold is 90 million divided by 240 million in revenue. 2014's historical data. The forecast ratio is 90 divided by 240, or 37.5% of revenue goes to costs of goods sold. To calculate forecasted cost in 2015, multiply 37.5%, which is the ratio value, times the forecasted revenue in 2015, which is 288 million, to get a forecasted cost of 108 million. And then we just do that for each item on the income statement. Again, see all that in the example. So we can talk about some typical forecast drivers for the income statement. Cost of goods sold, usually forecasted, the main driver is revenue. Likewise, SG&A. We talked about depreciation being a function of PP&E. Some of the more uncommon ones, like for non-operating income on the income statement, non-operating income typically is coming from income generated by our non-operating assets. So a lot of times this is just the dividends paid on equity investments, but it could be from any other non-operating asset. For instance, we could have an old building that we used to own that we're now leasing to a different company. That's not part of our operations, but it is income, lease income from this non-operating asset. So the forecast driver there is going to be the asset generating this non-operating income, and if it's going to change, if it has a growth rate. And so we try to stay away from estimating specific growth rates on non-operating assets, but that doesn't mean that we won't have a growth rate in the income generated by that asset. For instance, we could have a pre-built-in language in the lease contract that says every year the lease cost goes up by 5%. So then we would build that into our non-operating income. Every year, the non-operating income should go up by 5% because that's what the lease is going to do. Then we have things like interest expense and interest income, where interest expense is obviously a function of debt, because that's what I'm paying interest on, the loans that the firm has. So the more loans I have, the higher my interest payments will be. These can be forecasted, but most of the time we're not going to forecast these as a percentage, because my interest expense can be calculated directly. I just go look at the loan contracts if I have them. If I don't have them, then I forecast just the way I've done everything else. But if I'm inside the firm, I just look at the loan contracts and I say, okay, 7%, 5%, 6% on all the existing debt, we can calculate our interest expense directly. The only forecast that would come in is if I'm forecasting new debt, and then I would forecast the way that the interest expense changes with the new debt rate. Interest income would be money that I've earned from the firm's savings account, more or less. If I have any excess cash, I store that cash in a savings account that hopefully is an interest-bearing savings account. And so I'm forecasting my interest income as a percentage of that. And so here's some more examples. Again, I go into detail here in the example, so I'll just flip through some of this. The income statement, we're forecast depreciation, an example. Here's forecasting interest expense and interest income as we walk our way through. Now, step 4 is forecasting the balance sheet. And when we forecast the balance sheet, we do exactly the same thing as we do with the income statement. We want to look at the levels of the balance sheet, identify the items, the drivers of each line item, the drivers of each line item, and then build a forecast ratio and then forecast using that. So here's some common stuff. Accounts receivable, remember this is money that people owe us. We've sold product on credit, and typically this is going to be a constant function of revenue. In other words, depending on the firm, it's going to determine how much of my sales are done on a receivables basis versus a cash basis. So sometimes I'm going to sell product in cash, sometimes I'm going to sell product as a loan, and then I'm going to get my receivable, I'll book that as a receivable, I'll get that cash in 30 days instead of right now. So some firms are going to have 10% of their sales be on a receivables basis, some might be 50, some might be 100. It just totally depends on the firm. So we're going to forecast that based on revenue, but really we're forecasting it based on the historical performance of the firm. Historically, how much of our revenue has been on a receivables basis? That's what we're asking. Inventory. Inventory is all the product we have on hand that we haven't sold yet. Now this is going to be more a function of cost of goods sold. In other words, we want to know how much of our cost of goods sold goes to inventory and how much of it is sitting there right now. Accounts payable, also a function of cost of goods sold. Remember, this is supplies that we've bought on credit. And so we're trying to understand how much of our inputs do we buy on a payable basis rather than buy in cash. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll convert these working capital accounts into what's called days accounts instead of the actual ratio. We'll change it to a days ratio. And you'll see an example of that when I do the Excel example, when you look through it. You got things like accrued expenses as a function of revenue.